thrilled that we had the privilege to be able to put these together into a bonus.
You know what? Make sure you enjoy watching.
Nina Teicholz, thank you very much for being here. We have been waiting to do this interview because the work that you've done over the past decade and beyond is so important to our world, especially to our country and the health of our future, the health of all of us and our children and grandchildren beyond. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here.
Can you tell me just a little bit about your background and what got you into the work that you do today?
Yes, well, I'm a journalist, and I had studied biology a little bit at Stanford and Yale, but I really had not done anything in this field until I started to write a series of investigative food stories for Gourmet magazine, and they assigned me a story on trans fats.
When was this?
This is in the early 2000s. So what were trans fats? I had no idea. I had no interest in nutrition. But this opened up a whole world for me. First of all, I mean, dietary fat is what everybody obsesses about most in eating, myself included. I mean, I was a low-fat vegetarian for 25 plus years, like not eating any butter, no meat, thinking I was, and I was pretty actually overweight at the time. But Americans obsess about fat, non-fat, low-fat, good fat, bad fat. I mean, how confusing is the subject of fat? And now we're these fats I had never heard of, trans fats. And in researching this subject, it opened up this whole mysterious world. I mean, all of a sudden I found that the story seemed to be, first of all, kind of upside down and backwards from what we had always thought. That the low-fat diet is good, that saturated fats, the kind of fats in animal foods, are bad for us. And I also started doing interviews with PhD scientists, and they were so closed to talking about this subject, and they seemed to be so afraid. Like they would say things like, "I can't talk about that study," or "I can't, if we're going to talk about fat, I have nothing to say." Or they would hang up the phone on me.
Wow.
And so sometimes I would get off the phone and I would be trembling like I had been investigating the mob. Like, what is going on in this field of science? Or stories about people getting their papers yanked from journals because somebody from the margarine industry had visited a newspaper editor. Or I just discovered that this world, it seemed like there was sort of a cover-up story here. So this is what entered me into this fascinating world. And I ended up spending really almost a decade of my life to investigate and research for my book. I mean, like thousands and thousands and thousands of scientific studies trying to get to the bottom of this question. Like, is fat and cholesterol, are they bad for health? Should I not eat meat? What is the story there?
This article that you wrote for Gourmet magazine on trans fats really opened up your curiosity into your own health, it sounds like. And from there, you spent a decade writing a book on the topic.
Right, so that book is The Big Fat Surprise, and that was the culmination of all this work. It's a work really it tells the story of the science, kind of science gone wrong, the personalities, the politics, the players. It's kind of a thriller. Like my favorite description of my book is by The Economist, which said, this is a nutrition thriller. It's a page turner that you can't put down, because it is an incredible story about how science got off track and how there seemed to be no return. And it's really a book more ultimately about politics than science, because politics is what explains how we are in this position that we are today, which is a hypothesis about fat and heart disease and obesity that could never be proven, despite billions of dollars by our government trying to prove this hypothesis true, and they never could. So why do we still have it? That's the political story.
So let's start at the beginning of this misinformation, miscommunication that occurred, and take us through the journey.
So it was also true that when I was starting out my research, I had this little tiny restaurant review column, like in a little free throwaway newspaper, neighborhood newspaper. And they would send me to restaurants, and we didn't have any budget to pay for meals, so we would just had to accept whatever the restaurant decided was their favorite food that they wanted to showcase, and I had to accept it. So, and remember, I'm a vegetarian, so normally I would go into a restaurant and order stir-fried vegetables or some vegetarian entree, and instead I discovered that's not what chefs wanted to showcase in many of these restaurants. They wanted to send out their red meat and their foie gras and all these sort of forbidden foods that I hadn't eaten for decades. And I thought I found them sort of, when I got over my fear, I thought they were earthy and rich and textured and really interesting flavors. And then I discovered, a couple months into this, that I was really losing weight, like quite a lot of weight, which I had always been had a tough time, like many women, with my weight. And so not only was I effortlessly dropping weight, but I went to my doctor and he did my whole cholesterol panel and he said, you look better than ever. So that was another part of this mystery. Like, here I was doing everything wrong, but I looked healthier than I had in decades. So
And your doctor proved it out too through your blood work.
yeah, so all my cholesterol levels look better,
Wow.
I mean, whereas before when I was young, I had gone to spas to try to lose weight. And I still have the medical sheet from one of those saying, you're overweight and your cholesterol doesn't look good. Saturated fat is bad. Make sure you lower your saturated fat. So since the early 2000s, there's been a huge volume of studies now looking at this idea. Maybe it's not fat. Maybe it's carbohydrates. What is the effect of carbohydrates? So that has led to a large and fast-growing volume of literature now that really makes the case that it's really carbohydrates are what we need to reduce in order to be healthy.
And so why is it in today's climate, when you say the three-letter word, fat,
Right.
most of the time you're going to get a negative response? And low fat, no fat, diet products, they're everywhere. Why do you think we are living in this paradigm? And has the shift begun, or where are we going from your experience?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that we have been living with misinformation for over half a century. So we are completely convinced that fat is bad for health. Saturated fat is the worst kind of fat. And so it's very hard to reverse out of that thinking. An amazing thing you may not know is that there is actually no more low-fat diet advice. If you go look for the word low-fat on the website of the American Heart Association or the U.S. government, which publishes the dietary guidelines, which is where those are the two most important bodies issuing dietary advice, the word low-fat, not there anymore.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Nobody knows that. So that's because
When did it go away?
So they've sort of been tiptoeing away from it slowly. There has actually not been any low-fat dietary advice since 2000, the year
Wow.
2000. So isn't that incredible? So they're kind of like just slow reverse, quietly reversing out of the low-fat diet. But the public hasn't been told. There's never been an announcement, a public relations release saying, hey, we are completely reversing all of our advice from the last 35 years. And for reasons, I don't know, maybe it's liability, maybe they fear being sued for having given the wrong advice to people for so many decades. I really don't know the reason why. So we no longer have a low-fat diet. We also no longer have any caps on cholesterol. That was center staged, a pillar of advice. Avoid cholesterol, don't eat egg yolks, don't have shellfish, don't eat liver. All of that is because it has high cholesterol content. But the American Heart Association backed out of their advice in 2013, and 2015 the government also dropped it. So those are two pillars of dietary advice for the last 50 years gone. But saturated fats is like the remaining, pillar of dietary advice that they have not backed out of. And the reason that we haven't backed out of this advice publicly, or the saturated fat caps still exist, is a complicated set of explanations. I mean, one of them is certainly the food industry. That's sort of the bogeyman that we all know and read about in the media. The food industry has definitely invested in huge amounts of money in trying to influence scientists, influence science. One industry that I detail a great deal in my book is the vegetable oil industry. Because if you're not eating saturated fats, you're eating unsaturated, polyunsaturated vegetable oils. And so who are the vegetable oil companies? Some of the biggest companies in the world, ADM, Monsanto, Cargill, Bunge, these are huge multinational companies. Some of them were really in there from the start. I mean, one story I found in my book was that Procter and Gamble, maker of Crisco oil, they actually trained their eyes on the American Heart Association back in 1948. So at the time, the American Heart Association was like this little sleepy kind of cardiologist association. Remember, cardiology was a new it was a new
Right.
profession because heart disease was so rare. So they had no money, they had no budget, and Procter and Gamble decided to designate the American Heart Association as the beneficiary of this very popular radio show, and such that they overnight, I mean, according to their own official histories, they say overnight millions of dollars flowed into our coffers, and we were handed over checks by Procter and Gamble themselves at this exciting banquet. And they said, you know, if that was what enabled us to become the powerhouse that we are today,
Remarkable.
the biggest nonprofit in the country. So, and not too long afterwards, the American Heart Association is saying, eat vegetable oils rather than saturated fats. And actually, the president of the American Heart Association was criticized by one of his colleagues. He said, isn't that just rank commercialism that you held up a bottle of Crisco oil in that movie that you did, Mr. President? Because they had been paid, I guess, to promote those oils. What has kept these policies in place? So the food industry has clearly played a role. There are so many companies that benefit from our current dietary advice, you know, soy, grain, corn. Those are all huge beneficiaries. And they know how to manipulate the science really at the root. They're not so stupid as to wait until the science comes out and policy is being made. They know that if they get in there in the early starts, get people at conferences, fund the science to have it come out the way they want, that's the way to really influence what science is out there.
And even at the university level, when the students are learning, they're funding their lunches, they're funding their events that they go to. I mean, I have a number of good friends that are just going through college right now in these different industries, and Monsanto and so many others are funding a good portion of their experiences throughout university.
They fund media retreats. They fund, you look at the list of funders for the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association, the American Dietetics Association. They're all, you know, major food companies, ingredient manufacturers, and pharmaceutical companies. When I first started doing this research, I thought, why is Big Pharma funding nutritionists? They have nothing to do with nutrition. That's about food. But first of all, they have a clear interest in keeping people unwell. If it turns out that you can cure yourself by eating a healthy diet, you no longer need all those medications. And that, unfortunately, is a huge conflict of interest for Big Pharma.
Right.
And they also benefit from nutrition experts promoting the whole LDL hypothesis, that you need to lower your LDL cholesterol by reducing saturated fats, because Big Pharma, the only thing they know how to do, they have medication for, is LDL lowering medication. They tried to make medication that would raise your HDL, your good cholesterol. They couldn't do it. So they're not interested in that heart disease risk factor, even though that one turns out to be a better predictor of heart attacks. They can't lower your triglycerides, which are driven by carbohydrate intake. That's another. So they don't have a pill for that. So they're really interested in promoting a theory for which the theory that fat and saturated fat are bad for health, because that's what they have pills for. So there's industry interests behind all of this, clearly. But I think there are other explanations that are less obvious. One of them is that early on, the scientists truly believed this hypothesis. You know, they sort of fell in love with this hypothesis. They could not accept any evidence to the contrary. They just couldn't see it. Even in their own papers, some of the most amazing experiences I had was reading their own papers where their data says one thing. Their data says no effective saturated fat. And their little summary at the top says the
Really?
opposite. They couldn't even believe their own data. So these early scientists just could never challenge their own beliefs. I think the next generation of scientists, many of them are also believers, but now we have a situation where 3 generations of scientists at top universities have invested themselves in this idea of the diet heart hypothesis, and it's just nearly impossible to reverse out. It's just the level of cognitive dissonance to think my career has been wrong, our institution has been wrong, I think it's just sort of an insurmountable obstacle for many of these professionals at all these top universities. And I think the other factor is that this idea became institutionalized. So then you had, National Institute of Health, American Heart Association, every other association has adopted this advice. Well, institutional science is a little bit of an oxymoron. What is science? Science needs to be self-doubting, self-questioning. When you see new observations, you have to shift your idea maybe. Maybe you weren't right. Institutions are the opposite. They have to be steady.
Right.
They want their publics to trust them. They can't be flip-flopping on their public. They cannot shift their course very easily. So we have a situation where a weak hypothesis based on very insubstantial evidence became institutionalized, and then it just became rigid. And it's just seemingly impossible to abandon it.
And so while it's becoming rigid, our overweight and obesity situation is becoming an epidemic.
Which amazingly, they continue to, instead of reflecting upon themselves and saying, maybe we got it wrong, maybe our advice isn't perfect. Obesity and type 2 diabetes continue to rocket on upwards, and we've just been giving the same advice for the past 35 years. I mean, the definition of insanity is to repeat the same advice over and over and expect different outcomes, right? But instead, they blame the American public. They tell everybody out there, you're not working hard enough, your diet is not good enough, you don't exercise enough, you're fat and you're lazy and you fail to adhere. And that's basically what they tell the American people, that it's their fault.
And so as an American person, most of us this country is built on immigrants. Talk to us a little bit about how, as an American, we would accept this hypothesis, really, right?
Right.
Where is the proof? Why would we be the types of people that would accept this kind of information?
Why would we be so, receptive to...
Yes.
Well, it's interesting. I've thought about this quite a lot because I've done interviews and talked to people in other countries, and they will say, this low-fat thing, I never really believed it.
Right.
Even in the U.S., people in the middle of the country, more in the Midwest and the South, and they say, I grew up on a ranch or a farm, and we always had whole milk, and none of us were fat, and my grandfather ate bacon for breakfast every day. They sort of remember, they have their own heritage they haven't given up. But in the 50s, really, and 60s, when Ansel Keys and his ideas were coming in, most American women who did the cooking, they're immigrants, right? Or they come from immigrant families. So they don't really have their grandmother's recipes right there. Or they're not celebrating their family holidays maybe with their grandparents because they're immigrants. And at that time, families, if you came to America, you tried to assimilate. So you just want to do whatever is new and right? Yes, of course you're going to choose Crisco over the lard of your grandmother. And actually that was the way Crisco was marketed. Forgo lard, it's like the spinning wheel of your grandmother. Oh. Here, have something new and clean that comes out of a chemistry lab from clean, shiny surfaces named Crisco, which is hardened vegetable oils, which never existed until the early 1900s. So I think as an immigrant nation, we were just more susceptible to these ideas that came from scientists. They put the man on the moon. We did all kinds of amazing advances with science. Maybe science could solve the questions in our kitchen too. And we didn't have our grandmothers there our grandmothers' recipe books to rely upon. Whereas in other nations, I think they really are closer to their own traditions. But I want to say, I think it's a tragedy for many cultures around the world to adopt what turned out to be our bad advice, because food is a way of transmitting culture. It's part of each and every person's unique individual culture. We should not all be Mediterranean. If you're Swiss, you should eat, you should have the right to be part of your culture through your food and know that that's healthy and good.
I think you make a really good point. I was born in Switzerland, and as a little girl, I thought I came from Swiss cheese. So I was so connected culturally to the cheeses, to the good fats that stayed with me. And I remember also coming to this country and just being really confused about this whole idea of not being able to eat the foods that I had grown up with and loved and been nourished with. So I can only imagine for the mothers that were not able to rely on their grandmothers' ways of doing things, having their grandmothers' cookbooks, having those recipes that are passed down through the families that have nourished us for such periods of time, to not have that and instead go into this experiment, really.
It really has been an experiment on the entire American population without our consent. It's been an experiment on the whole American population that we were put on this low-fat diet, and it ruined our health.
And we can see it in the numbers today.
And I think that it is an amazing thing when you think about how somebody could imagine that a diet completely different from every generation before them could be the healthy diet that would protect them from heart disease, help them lose weight. Coming from, I know a French woman coming from, she said, I don't eat cheese because I don't want my children to be orphans. But she knows that her mother and her grandmother and her great-grandparents, they all ate cheese and they didn't die. So it is this kind of strange loss of knowledge of our history. When I was young, people always used to say to me in school, you must read history in order for it not to repeat itself, and you must be educated in history. And history was always my least favorite subject. But then when I started understanding this topic, I realized this is a case where we've just completely forgotten our history. Our own personal history, the history of our families, the history of what we used to eat. All of that we've just somehow completely forgotten.
So we fell into this hypothesis that has become the mantra of the way we live today, despite all the challenges that come with it. What do you think keeps us in this mindset? And can you tell us a little bit about the guidelines that we follow?
Yes. The reason that we continue to think that a high grain, low fat diet is good for health is that is still what we are told by all of our reigning experts. Harvard, Tufts, American Heart Association, and most importantly, the USDA dietary guidelines. So I'm sure everybody thinks, oh, the dietary guidelines, what are those? Who cares? I don't go to a .gov website to look up my dietary advice, but I think that they're the most powerful lever on the food supply and what people think is a healthy diet in the world, really.
Wow. Why do you say in the world?
Because the dietary guidelines, which began in 1980 in the U.S., they were really the first national guidelines telling people how to eat. And they came to be seen as the gold standard. And they were exported all over the world. So most countries nowadays follow the guidelines from the United States, and they consider them to be the absolute best science. But the U.S. guidelines, they basically just took what the American Heart Association had done and made a carbon copy of it. And they just downloaded what the American Heart Association was saying. And that has remained true. The American Heart Association and the USDA dietary guidelines are virtually identical.
And why would that be? Why is that?
Because the same experts who had been in charge of the American Heart Association guidelines really were the same people who then became part of the expert committees of the U.S. dietary guidelines.
I see.
So there's this small group of nutrition experts that really dominate nutrition policy. Originally it was Ansel Keys and his buddy Jerry Stamler, and there was a small group of, at that point, they were all men. Now there are some women in this club as well, but I call them the nutrition aristocrats because they are just so dominant. They run the expert committees at the American Heart Association and at the Dietary Guideline Committee. They're in charge. They're the ones who review the papers for the major medical journals. They sit on the editorial boards. They're really in control of nutrition policy and expert opinion. If you are not in with them, you will find it very hard to get your paper published or be invited to an expert conference. Oh. So they're really the people who control the nutrition agenda and what we think.
And how does the science sort of work with these guidelines? How does it actually translate, and how are the decisions made as to how many grains we should be eating? I'm sure there's some real science there.
Well, they assign every 5 years, they renew the guidelines. They assign an expert committee of 13 to 15 people, and those people are supposed to look over the best and most current science from the last 5 years and then produce an expert report. Well, when I looked at the 2015 expert report, I thought, well, I've just been reading science nonstop for 10 years. None of the science that I read was in this report. None of the science from the last 5 years was there. From 2010 to 2015 was one of the greatest reconsiderations of saturated fats. More than a dozen reviews came out, really questioning and concluding we got it wrong on saturated fats. The guidelines are not evidence-based. So I went looking for those studies in this expert report. Well, they might be there, but they misstated the conclusion, or they didn't include some of them. And the same was true on other studies. They never included. It turns out that no successive dietary guideline committee has ever looked at the vast majority of government-funded clinical trials on nutrition, which is to say the government has spent billions of dollars to try to figure out if fat and saturated fat are bad for health. And none of those studies have ever been reviewed by any successive dietary guideline committee.
How is it possible?
Well, it seems impossible, doesn't
Right,
it?
yes.
So I did a cover story for the British Medical Journal, the BMJ, with these facts. And the entire nutrition establishment came down upon my head for that. I basically said, you never looked at all the major nutrition trials, and there's almost no rigorous science in these guidelines, which is to say, you recommend these dietary patterns, but they're supported by a minuscule amount of clinical trial information, which is the rigorous kind of science that you need to show
Right.
cause and effect. So 180 nutrition scientists sign a letter from around the world, signed a letter saying, you must retract this paper, to the BMJ. You must take back this paper. We did somebody I know did some FOIA, Freedom of Information Act requests. It turns out this retraction letter went around the world. Dear colleague, please ask to retract this paper. Nobody asked a question, not a single question. What's wrong with the paper? Where are her mistakes? It was just like, silence this, get it out of the literature. It was such an offense to people. And I guess I knew it was an aggressive thing to do, but it felt like it had to be done. Somebody had to
Absolutely.
show that this is the truth. So the BMJ put the whole matter to outside reviewers, and after a year, they concluded that the facts are good, this paper stands, there's no reason for retraction. There were a few minor corrections that had absolutely no effect on any of the assertions in the paper. But, I mean, this effort to silence me is something that has gone on throughout nutrition science. This is one of the reasons that we don't have these studies. How is it possible that we haven't heard the results from all this government-funded research? And that is because the results of those studies, when they came out, they basically did not support Ansel Keys' hypothesis. They didn't support the idea that saturated fat was bad for health, that the low-fat diet could prevent any kind of disease. And so their results were effectively just ignored. I mean, there are really incredible stories about the results from the Framingham study showed that the more saturated fat you ate, the less likely you were to die of a heart attack. Those results in an NIH basement, never published. The results from the largest ever nutrition trial ever undertaken, called the Women's Health Initiative, on 49,000 women, all following the low-fat diet for 7 to 8 years. The results from that study, just completely stuffed. Nobody talks about them. Never reviewed, not included in any dietary guideline committee report. Just not there. Or if they have them, there's some like secondary analysis that doesn't really state the conclusions. You know, it is like a cover-up story. It's like the science doesn't go the way you want it, so just cover it up or don't talk about it. And really the most amazing example that I discovered was something called the Minnesota Coronary Survey, the biggest ever test of Ansel Keys' hypothesis. And it was on some 9,000 men and women in 5 Minnesota mental hospitals. The kind of experiment that you couldn't do today because it would be considered unethical to put people in a diet when they're institutionalized. But it's a really good experiment because you control everybody's food, right? When you're in it's called a highly controlled study. You really control everything they're eating. Mm-hmm. So half the people had what was considered a regular amount of saturated fat and cholesterol. So 18% of their calories were from saturated fat. That's like twice or 3 times the limit of what we're told to eat today. But meat, butter, cheese, everything normal. The other people in the experimental group, they had 9% saturated fat, which is still more than we're told to eat today. But they had soy-filled cheese, soy-filled milk, and vegetable patties instead of meat. At the end of that experiment, they could not show any benefit, any cardiovascular benefit. You were not spared a heart attack if you had cut your saturated fat intake by half. In other words, the diet heart hypothesis could not be shown to be true. That study was not published for 16 years. And when they finally did publish it, they put it in this little out-of-the-way journal that they knew no nutrition scientist would read. And when the principal investigator, Ivan France, was asked much later by a journalist, well, why did you not publish? And he said, well, there was nothing wrong with the study. We were just so disappointed in the way it came out. It's incredible. And then later in 2015, some NIH researchers discovered that actually Ivan France hadn't even published the full results. He found some other results in Ivan France's basement, which, on tapes, on old magnetic tapes, and they went back and examined them all. They found that the men who were most effective, most successful at lowering their cholesterol had the highest likelihood of dying of a heart attack. That result never published.
It is remarkable. I mean, even in today's climate, when I've spoken about a systematic review of the 40 top diets, right? And out of those, the 7, Dr. Steve Anton outlines with his team, the 7 that were the most effective of these diets, and the ones that had the double-blind placebo-controlled largest quantity and then produced the most weight loss over the most extended period of time were the ones that came up on top. And guess what? The one that came out on the very top was, of course, Dr. Atkins. And this low-carb diet, when you look at the individual participants that were part of these numerous studies, the ones that were doing the very, very best were the ones that ate the most fat. 55%, the highest level of fat in their diets were the ones that lost the most weight, and they kept the most weight off. And then we just look at sort of what diets come out on top for this year alone, and what are they, and where does Atkins sit?
Right at the bottom of the list. I mean, the U.S. News and World Report just came out with their best diet cover story, the ketogenic diet, which is very high in fat, at the absolute bottom of the list. Right. And the Atkins, they have something called Atkins, and Eco Atkins are in the, towards the bottom of the list. And then you look at the expert panel. The expert panel is animal welfare activists, vegetarians, people who have, an ideological kind of activist agenda about what we should eat. And they're obviously not looking at the science for what is healthy. The number 1 diet on the U.S. News and World cover story is the DASH diet. The DASH diet has only been tested on hypertensive subjects, never been tested on a normal population, never been shown to help people lose weight, never been shown to help people fight diabetes, and has a mixed impact on heart disease risk factors, because while it lowers your LDL, your bad cholesterol, it also lowers your good cholesterol. Your HDL comes down. So in the end, it's just kind of a wash. Also, how many people have been tested on the DASH diet? Number 1 diet by the U.S. News and World Report? Not more than 2,000 people, which is tiny. Compare that to the number of people who've been tested on low carb. Over 6,300 have been tested and shown that diet to be safe and effective for all those conditions: obesity, diabetes, heart disease. So it's like they're just not looking at the science because they have some other agenda.
So going back to these guidelines that are considered here in the U.S. to sort of lead the global, they're the gold standard, and they get reviewed every 5 years. Can you share with us a little bit more about them and where things are going and what you see based on the science or the lack thereof?
Right. Well, I became convinced the dietary guidelines are very important, not only because they lead the world, but again, even though you may not think that you're going to go to a .gov website to get your dietary advice, the dietary guidelines reach you.
Of course.
They are basically downloaded by the professional medical associations, and then they go out to every doctor, every nutritionist, every dietitian, everybody working on the front line. So when you go to a doctor, nutritionist, dietitian's office, you get the guidelines. They also are what largely determine school lunches, women and infant children feeding programs, foods in hospitals, feeding programs for the elderly, the food stamp program, and the military rations. We happen to have an obesity epidemic in the military, and it's not like they don't exercise.
Wait a moment here. The obesity epidemic is also part of the military.
Yes, they have a huge obesity problem in the military. You cannot blame them for not exercising enough. So what is that about? It's because they're feeding them food according to the dietary guidelines. So high in carbs, over 50% in carbs, and very low in fat. And that is, over time, I think that has been shown that is not a diet that helps you lose weight or keep you healthy. So the guidelines are just enormously influential on how people get, what people think is a healthy diet. They also really influence the food supply, because that little fact panel on the back of all food, that information is basically influenced by the guidelines. So when you read, why are you thinking about fat, saturated fat, worrying about many calories come from that, that comes from the guidelines. It also affects the food supply. When 1980, when the U.S. government told everybody to go on a low-fat diet, like all cattle were bred to be lean. Lean meat, lean pork. Now we have completely lean pork. Low-fat milk. Consumption of whole-fat milk has dropped by 79% since 1970. So if you look at all the food trends in America, they have all followed the guidelines. Red meat is down 34%. Grains are up 40%. Vegetable oils are up 89%. Fruits and vegetables have also increased by 20, 30%. Like, Americans really did everything that we were told to do. And that's because the guidelines are so powerful. What do you learn in school? What do my kids learn in school? They got the food pyramid or My Plate, and then in the case of my child, he had like a little booklet on why vegetable oils were so good that was for some reason in his classroom, like written by Monsanto. My kids, when they come home, they're like, Mom, I said, just keep your mouth shut when they're talking about nutrition. You just don't need to raise your hand and tell them that you have bacon for breakfast every morning. Both my children at school are like, their coaches are telling them they're going to kill themselves on this diet. And they've just learned, like, they just have to. So there's just, that is the information we get from everywhere.
And how much pressure for a child. I know with my kids, again, I feed them in the same way that you feed your children. And it's the natural way for them to eat, and gives them the energy and keeps them mentally focused and their blood sugar balanced. I mean, I'm doing it specifically for health reasons, and yet it is considered to be a fad or something that is new.
Or dangerous.
Worse,
you're endangering your children. So the guidelines really need to become more evidence-based. They need to look at those randomized controlled clinical trials on tens of thousands of Americans, paid for by the government. In order to inform our dietary guidelines, they need to actually reckon with those clinical trials and what they say. That's the most rigorous kind of evidence that we have. So, I think that the dietary guidelines need to be updated so that they really reflect the science. They really don't.
And why do you think it is that there's an experiment going on, there's a war on our health going on right now, and it's proven out in the numbers, right? With the high level of pre-diabetic and diabetic individuals, and the young children that are even dealing with diabetes, type 2 diabetes. It is a nightmare that we are living, and the obesity and the overweight just continuing to go up. Why is there not a war going on right now?
I think there is a bit of a war going on. I think we're in the midst of a real paradigm shift in nutrition. And I mean that the new science is pushing its way up. I mean, there are more and more academics now who are willing to stand up and say, we got it wrong on the dietary guidelines. There are more and more papers coming out concluding this is wrong, the advice that we're telling people. There's sort of, we think we've reached a kind of critical mass of PhDs who really who think we got it wrong on dietary fat. And at the same time, there's this kind of surge up from the bottom. This just, hundreds of thousands of people who have regained their health by ignoring the guidelines. And their stories are coming up. And those doctors who are helping those people are starting to speak out. So I think that between this kind of top-down change in the expert community and this surge up from the bottom, I think that we will see change. But it really will not, it won't come easy. Let's say the status quo establishment is really fighting back, and they fight back hard.
How are they fighting back?
They really go back to the same kind of bullying tactics that Ansel Keys pioneered. They beat up on anyone who speaks out by, claiming you're funded by the food industry, or your arguments are full of holes, or you must only be out to sell books, this is the treatment that I get relentlessly. And because I don't have the right degrees after my name, they'll say, she's just a journalist. And it's been easier for me to stand up now because The Lancet came out with a full-page review of my book saying...
Talk about that.
So, initially when I was just relentlessly attacked, really called nasty names by top scientists, and had this retraction effort for my paper in the BMJ. It's a brutal experience, and it's intended to be brutal. It's intended to silence me and my voice so that it would be much easier just to give up and say, that's too much abuse, right? And it's what any normal person would probably do. I just happen to be really stubborn. But, and it's also a cautionary tale to other people out there saying, right, don't stick your neck up because we will whack it. And I have talked to many people who say, I'm happy to support you from the background. I'll write you nice emails, but I do not want my voice to be out there because people know they'll be attacked. So what makes it easier for me now is that, I've had really excellent reviews of my book and my work by the British Medical Journal, the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Right. The Lancet recently came out and said, this book will make you mad, but we checked it and we looked at the science, and she's right. And you must reckon with this. But so I think that now this kind of, high level validation helps me fight back and say, look, it's not just me. There's really, a number of people who are making the same argument. And you must reckon with this truth that we've discovered about nutrition science. So I think that between this kind of shift in expert opinion, the willingness of experts to stand up and be whistleblowers inside their own field, and this bottom-up surge of people curing themselves by ignoring the guidelines, I think we will see change. I think that this paradigm shift is happening. And I think it will be a battle to get to the end, but I think that the next few years we really will see change.
You can't argue with the results that people are getting from a health perspective and the way that we feel when we incorporate more saturated fats, more good fats. I think the conversation around the bad fats is just really starting to happen, and it's something that you've been talking about for many, many years.
Well, really the central thesis of my book is that saturated fats, the kind of fats found in meat, butter, but also coconut oil, palm oil, that these fats were unfairly villainized and do not cause heart disease. So, I go through all the clinical trials that were done on them. Ultimately, more than 65,000 people tested all around the world to see if saturated fats would cause heart disease. And none of those studies could show that to be true. And then I go through sort of the, what is the effect of saturated fat on the body? It turns out that saturated fat is the only food known to raise your good cholesterol, your HDL. So if you go to your doctor and he says, your HDL is low, you really need to get it up. And how do you do that? He's like, well, you can drink red wine or you can try to exercise more. But really the most efficient way to raise your HDL is to eat saturated fat. it reliably raises HDL. And the vegetarian diet consistently causes HDL to drop. So it turns out HDL is a much more effective marker of your heart disease risk. Actually, the most effective marker that we commonly measure is HDL over triglycerides. HDL is driven by saturated fat intake. Triglycerides are driven by your carbohydrate intake. So the diet that will best improve your heart disease risk factors and reduce your risk of a heart attack is high in saturated fat and low in carbohydrates.
So with the Lancet paper, that was rather recent, is that correct?
It was in August of 2017. So this is more than 3 years after my book is published. But I think that this shows the paradigm shift, right? It takes people a while to absorb the information, and the fact that they felt that they wanted to stand up and say, we need to reconsider the science. But I think it also shows that this is experts at the very top saying we need to be our own whistleblowers in our own field, and we need to reckon with what's gone on in nutrition science. We can't, like some random journalist, she can't be the one doing this. We have to take responsibility for what happened in our field, and I think that's completely right.
It's really remarkable to think that 3 years later, out comes this paper that says, you were right, Nina was right, and here's why. Your book was a New York Times bestseller. And years later, the information is still coming out to prove your point. And I think exactly what you're saying. When I go and meet with professors across the globe at different universities, and you see the kind of diet that they're doing in their own colleges, in their own departments, and it's low carb, and they're getting into keto, and they're eating more saturated fats and putting coconut oil in their coffee. And I see it everywhere. I see it all the time. I think you make a really good point.
Well, and also I think scientists don't want to be caught having been wrong and being so behind the curve. They don't, at some point, the field is going to change and they will look like dinosaurs if they do not at least acknowledge that some of their assumptions need to be questioned and there are problems in the field. So I think that's part of the motivation. They need to not be on the wrong side of history. So it's interesting. It's not coming so much from the nutrition expert community itself. It's really coming sort of one step removed, more from the medical community. I mean, that's a community where they understand what evidence-based science is supposed to look like, right? They know that if a doctor gives a pill and says, oh, you know what, we did a clinical trial on this and it didn't show any benefit, but we're still going to give it to you. You'd be in the medical community, that would be laughed out of the, off the table, right? But that is what we do in diet, in nutrition diet. Follow this advice, follow this diet. We did a clinical trial, it didn't work at all, but here, I'm giving it to you. So it really is the medical community looking at the bad nutrition science that is saying, what is going on with that field? How can you advise diets that are not based on any good evidence or has actually been contradicted by the evidence that we have? So I think that's what's going on.
In 1965, you were telling us a little bit about what the average American diet was.
Yes, this is a really incredible discovery that I made, which is that, according to the best available government data that we have, which is admittedly not great, but this is what we have, it tells us that in 1965, Americans ate 39% of their calories as carbohydrates. So that is a low-carb diet. That's what we call a low-carb diet. And they were eating over 40% of their calories as fat. That's a low-carb diet. All of America was on what we would now call a low-carb diet in 1965.
What we would now call almost a fad diet or maybe a dangerous diet, to your point, right?
But all of America was following this diet.
Wow.
In 1965. All we have to do is go back to what we were eating in 1965. Do we need dietary guidelines? No, let's just go back to what we were doing in 1965. That would be perfectly a good solution.
When you look at the different oils that we ingest and the issues around vegetable oils, share with us a little bit more about some of the research that you've uncovered.
Well, one thing that I found was that vegetable oils, you have to understand, vegetable oils were new to America. They were not part of our diet until the early 1900s. Before that, like every Western country in the world, we cooked with butter and lard, period. And some tallow and maybe some suet, that's beef and lamb fat, but mainly lard, which comes from pigs, and butter. Then in the early 1900s, they figured out how to press oil out of seeds. It's really seed oil. It's not vegetable oil. Sunflower seeds, safflower seeds, cottonseed was the big one in the beginning. And initially, this oil was used as industrial lubricants for machines. Part of what helped, when they ran out of whale oil, they turned to these seed oils for the Industrial Revolution. Then they discovered if they could put this oil, which was gray and smelly and disgusting, through a long process of like 15 steps, winterized, deodorized, hydrogenate, they got a product that smelled good and it looked like lard.
15 steps.
Yeah, at least. I mean,
Wow.
it goes through so many steps. It comes in the factory steps. It's just incredible what they do to make this, comestible for human beings. So they came out with this product they could make it white and it looked like lard. So they decided and it was used, initially it was developed by Procter & Gamble. They had the initial patent for this, and they thought they would use it. They were candle makers and soap makers, so they thought they would sell it as, use it for candles and soap. And somebody said, let's sell this as substitution lard. So they did. They sold it as Crisco, and they told American women, give up your lard, the smelly, smells, and old-fashioned lard, and buy this new product that we scientists have made. So the rise in consumption of vegetable oils really is the biggest increase of consumption of any food product over the course of the 20th century. First, it was this hardened lard, then came margarine, substitute for butter. That's also hardened vegetable oil. The oil itself, they couldn't figure out how to stabilize that. So not until the 1940s did they figure out how to sell oil in bottles, like Mazola oil and Crisco oil. And those products really became the staples of American kitchens. So sunflower oil, safflower oil. Then it mainly became soybean oil. They found out how to take this byproduct from soybeans and make it into, the most commonly consumed oil today. So I discovered that these oils were investigated. They were so worrisome, any kind of finding they came out with, they killed rats in the animal experiments, the hardened vegetable oils, made cells rigid and would sort of stick in cell membranes. That's what trans fats were. And that research just sort of disappeared, right? If nobody's funding the research, then it doesn't happen. So you remember, NIH believes vegetable oil should be promoted. American Heart Association believes vegetable oil should be promoted. The food companies are not going to fund research against their own products. So there's just no research on vegetable oils. And then the next thing I learned about vegetable oils came from one of my sources at a top vegetable oil company, Loders and Crocklin. And he said to me, there's a huge problem with these trans-free oils. So remember, when we got rid of trans fats were there because in order to make oils stable, you have to harden them through the process of hydrogenation. One of the byproducts of hydrogenation is trans fats. Trans fats, we found out, are bad for health. So they had to get rid of trans fats. But remember, that hardened oil, they hardened it to make it stable. And so now we have to just go back to regular old vegetable oils. Well, what is the problem with that? So this source of mine in this vegetable oil company, he says, well, now that we have these trans-free oils, they're not stable. And they are oxidizing. That means they degrade into hundreds of oxidation products. And he said it's a huge problem because every fast food chain, Burger King, McDonald's, you name it, they're all using these oils. And these oxidation products turn into like a witch's brew, were his words. They get hard, like polymers, like hardened paint. And the workers were trying to scrape it off the walls. It was covering the walls. It was clogging up the drains of the fryers. The oxidation products were so unstable that when the workers took off their uniforms and they put them in the truck to go to the dry cleaners, they would spontaneously combust in the back of the truck because there's all these like highly unstable oxidation products, and then put them in the dryers and they would catch the dryer on fire. So it was this incredible state, like, and this is what we're consuming. And these oxidation products easily pass into the food. That was shown by this scientist I interviewed, in Chelmy is her name. They pass into the food, they pass into your body, and it turns out they seem to cause massive inflammation, septic shock even. The scientist told me the amount of these toxic oxidation products required to produce septic shock is surprisingly feasible with the regular average American diet. So what happened? The major companies, they came up with all kinds of solutions to try to make these oils more stable. They developed something called little silicone beads that you put in that tries to absorb all the toxic oxidation products, or they put these kinds of nitrogen blankets on top of them, on top of the fryers, so that they don't go into the air, these products. And all of this oxidation happens well below smoke point. So smoke point is not something that is reliable in judging these kinds of effects.
Interesting. And you really aren't hearing that much yet about the below smoke point issues. It's still very, very new, and people are understanding, okay, smoke point is dangerous, but it's these places that go below it that you're talking about.
Oxidation is happening even at room temperature. Mm-hmm. It happens with very little heat. And it happens because polyunsaturated vegetable oils, poly refers to multiple double bonds. So every single one of those double bonds in a molecule can, when it's heated just a little bit, or maybe there's a little bit of sunlight that comes into your kitchen, those double bonds open up, and each of those bonds reaches out and grabs an oxygen molecule. It binds to it. Oxygen, oxidation, inflammation. That's what happens. So olive oil is a little bit safer because it's a monounsaturated fat. It means it only has one double bond, only one opportunity to bond with oxygen. But the idea that any of these oils, canola oil or any of these oils, are safe to cook with is really, is not true. So that's why they tell you to store oil in dark bottles, because even light will start this oxidation process. And the fats that are safe to cook with are saturated fats. They're saturated with hydrogen. They have no double bonds. They cannot bind with oxygen. So that's what makes them safe to heat up. Heating up is what speeds up chemical reactions.
Right.
So what is safe to cook with are saturated fats, lard, butter, coconut oil. The fats that humans have traditionally eaten, natural fats, naturally occurring fats.
Nina, thank you so much for sharing over a decade's worth of incredible research, investigative research that has been proven time and time again, not just through creating a New York Times bestseller, but through all of the support that you're getting now more and more through different communities and different papers. So congratulations, and thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you very much for having me. And I want to say thank you for helping get this knowledge out there. I really am grateful to you.